mentioned earlier that I had a database of 590 gunfights between all these fellows. Of the 590 gunfights, believe it or not, 408 produced at least one fatality, many of them more than one. So that's 69%. That's 7 out of 10 that produced fatalities. And many more than one fatality, 638 men were killed in those 408 gunfights. So it wasn't just mano a mano. Therefore, only 31% failed to produce a fatality. I rated the 256 gunfighters that I was able to study, and based on the number of killings they committed, based on the number of gunfights they were in, based on the number of men they even wounded. Of the top 15 of these rated gunfighters, 10 of them spent most of their careers in Texas. There was Killing Jim Miller, the West's premier assassin. John Wesley Hardin, preacher's son who was kill crazy. He killed his first man at 15, and he shot up guys until he was finally caught in his 20s by a Texas Ranger, and they stuck him in jail in Huntsville for 17 years. John Selman, after Hardin got out, he drifted out to El Paso, and John Selman, another hard case who was no stranger to gunplay, he killed Hardin. Later, Selman was shot dead in El Paso. Both Selman and Hardin, interestingly enough, are buried not too far apart in El Paso's Concordia Cemetery. Dallas Studemeyer, he was a Civil War veteran. He actually tamed El Paso for a time. He was killed out there too. He was a two-gun man, but he liked to carry his guns in 2 leather-lined hip pockets. Ben Thompson, perhaps he was the first gunfighter. He was raised here in Austin. And as a youngster growing up in the 1850s here, he did not back off from fights. He got into some knife things. He shotgunned a couple of guys with birdshot. And he was a formidable character until he was killed in San Antonio, alongside his friend, King Fisher, who was another formidable character from Uvalde. Long-haired Jim Courtwright of Fort Worth. We have Marshal of Fort Worth, and he was a two-gun man. And he was a very dangerous hombre, too. And then, among the 10 of the 15, legendary Texas Ranger Captain John Hughes. John Hughes got into his first gunfight. This speaks to his aggressiveness when he was 15 years of age. And he got shot in the right arm. And that impaired the use of his right arm so that he couldn't really handle a gun well with it, but he did not want out of the game. And he began to practice with his left hand until people thought he was a natural southpaw. I've mentioned that there were more blood feuds in Texas than any other state or territory. It began with the Regulator Moderator War. That was part of the Regulator Moderator War tradition we had had since the Revolutionary period. And it was fought out in Texas, in East Texas, from 1840 to 44. Of course, East Texas was a frontier at that time. 31 men were killed. 200 men, armed men, rode as regulators. 100 armed men rode as moderators. And it was, in the number of participants and the number of men killed, it was the bloodiest feud that we ever had in Texas. And that was just for starters. And there's also the vendetta effect. Some of the dead were killed after the feud supposedly ended, broken up by Republic President Sam Houston and about 600 militia. There was Doc Sonnichsen. C.L. Sonnichsen was the first scholar to really study feuding in Texas. He was an English teacher, an English professor at what is today University of Texas El Paso. And I had the privilege of working with Doc on some projects in the 1980s. And Doc was fond of quoting the Bible in regards to Texas feuding. A saying that he used as a chapter title once. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." But in Texas, he's always had plenty of help. And sure enough, it was true. The vendetta always was part of these feuds. And in the case of the Regulator Moderator War, a couple of years after the war supposedly ended, there was a moderator, a couple from a couple of moderator families who decided to get married, and a bitter regulator guy poisoned the wedding cake. Saw to it that the wedding cake was poisoned. Everybody who ate it got sick, and we think about 8 to 10 died. If that's the case, there were upwards of 40 people who died in that. It's the bloodiest feud the West ever saw. I'm tell you what, Hatfields and McCoys come to East Texas during that period, we'd have wiped out those backwoods warriors from back east. Over the next 7 decades, there were all kinds of blood feuds in Texas. A favorite of mine was the Higgins feud. The Higgins feud. This is a bunch of trail drivers. The trail boss was Pink Higgins, and one of his riders was my great-grandfather, Jess Standard. And Pink was in this kind of stuff all his life. He killed his last man when he was in his 50s, when he was working as a stock detective, but it was a duel. And so there were all manner of these kinds of feuds, and the last was in the second decade of the 20th century, 1916, 17, and 18. And in fact, Pink's oldest son, Judge Cullen Higgins, was assassinated in the Johnson-Sims feud. It was, I wrote a book about it, the Johnson-Sims feud, and I subtitled it Romeo and Juliet, West Texas style, and it certainly was that. As I say, as a Wild West soap opera, it also involved Frank Hamer, yet to gain fame as the killer of Bonnie and Clyde, but he was in a desperate shootout during this war. It won't surprise you that drinking often was a factor in gunfighting. A lot of shootouts occurred in saloons or involved drunken participants. All but 2. Doc Holliday's gunfights occurred in saloons. The same number applies to Wild Bill Hickok. Hickok was killed in Deadwood's Saloon number 10. Wes Hardin was killed in El Paso's Acme Saloon. Warren Earp, youngest of the Earp brothers, he was killed in a corner saloon in Wilcox, Arizona. Big Dallas Studenmeyer was killed in a wild saloon fight in El Paso. Killing Jim Miller shotgunned Sheriff Bud Frazier in a Toyah, Texas saloon. Toyah's west of Pecos. Ben Thompson and King Fisher were killed in San Antonio's most popular saloon and dance hall, where Thompson had killed the owner 2 years earlier. Both father and son, Texas gunman Emmanuel Clements and Emmanuel Jr., he was called Manny, they were slain in Texas saloons about 2 decades apart. Daddy was killed in a Ballinger saloon in 1887, and Manny was killed in 1908 in an El Paso saloon. Doc Holliday's first gunfight occurred in a Dallas saloon where he was practicing dentistry. He soon moved a little bit farther west to Fort Griffin, where he hooked up with Big Nose Kate before they moved on to Arizona, Corral, New Mexico, and Colorado. Bat Masterson's first gunfight was in a saloon in Mobeetie, 2 people dead and Bat wounded. A word about lynching. Colonel Charles Lynch of Lynchburg, Virginia, is who lent his name to that. He didn't particularly want to, but it came during the breakdown of law and order in the decade preceding the American Revolution, and that included, incidentally, the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre, but a whole lot of other riot situations, anti-tax collector situations. The authority was just breaking down. And so leading citizens established Colonel Lynch in charge of an extra-legal court that would basically flog the bad guys and drive them out of the county. But one group of bad guys didn't intend to get flogged, and they fought it out, and 16 of them were killed. And then more and more extra-legal situations ended with hanging. And during the 18th, the 19th, and the early part of the 20th century, some 6,000 men and a few women were executed by vigilante actions. On many frontiers, the westward movement outraced the establishment of courts, law officers, even jails. Most frontier counties were poor because the economy wasn't developed yet. They were frontier. And vigilante action, therefore, was quicker and it was cheaper than any system of courts, judges, juries, attorneys, trials, appeals, and institutional punishment. Thus, there were many lynchings in the Old West and several hundred in Texas. Now, a large percentage of the Texas lynchings were racial, but An unusually large number of Texas lynchings also had to do with law and order, restoring law and order. And it wasn't always just hanging. One notable case occurred in Belton in 1874. The western half of Bell County, of which Belton was the seat, Bell County's western part was very broken. It was offered perfect hideouts for bad guys, including a guy who axe murdered his wife. He fit right in with all those rustlers and so forth. And so the good guys decided, okay, we are going to clear this. We're going to clear this bunch out. And several hundred citizens made a sweep of the western part of the county. They caught 10 guys, including the axe murderer. And they brought them into this new jail they had. It was a 2-story brick jail, only 2 years old. And they put him in a holding cell. One of the guys got sick right away, and they put him in another cell. That left 9 in the holding cell, and a lynch mob hit that jail that night, all this pre-planned. And the guards were never going to fight it out to the death with people who were their neighbors on account of an axe murderer. And so they just basically let them in, and the crowd surrounded that cell, pointed their guns in through the bars, and executed those guys. No trouble with hanging, just shot them all down. Same thing happened 4 years later in Meridian. 2 of the Harrell brothers, the notorious Harrell brothers, killers and rustlers and so forth, 2 of them had been arrested for killing a well-known merchant, very well-liked guy, following a robbery. And they were in jail. The sheriff was given a note that his mother was dying in another town. He was relieved when he got to the other town to see that she wasn't dead. However, by that time, the Harrell brothers had been killed. He's out of town. About 100 men crowded into the jail. 50 of them were close enough to stick their guns through the bars. One of the Harrell brothers had 22 bullets in him. A word about gunfighter towns. Everyone knows about Dodge City, the Kansas cow towns of Abilene and Wichita and so forth. Deadwood, where Wild Bill Hickok was killed. Lincoln, New Mexico Territory, where Billy the Kid ran rampant, where the Lincoln County War occurred. Tombstone, Arizona, in the late 70s and early 1880s, and that town had about 10,000 people in it at its height. So little wonder that a lot of bad stuff happened. There were saloon fights galore in the late 70s, early 80s, and in 1881, the most famous gunfight of all happened at the OK Corral. 3 brothers and Doc Holliday took on 5 people that they did not get along with, and they killed 3 of them. Those 3 were taken to Tombstone's famous Boot Hill. But wait a minute. 5 years later in Tascosa, Texas, the big fight, as they called it, occurred. At 2 a.m., it exploded in a saloon at the town's intersection, and 4 people were killed. 4 people. Tascosa's Boot Hill. We got a Boot Hill just about as good as the one in Arizona, I can tell you. In fact, there were 10 fatal shootouts during the heyday of Tascosa, of that period. 10 fatal shootouts, as well as assorted others. And so, while Tascosa was correctly called the cowboy capital of the Panhandle, you could also call it the gunfighter capital of the Panhandle.